He had not cooked dinner for anyone other than his son in 4 years. But there he stood on a Wednesday evening, staring at a restaurant menu posted in the window of a place called Birchwood on Elgin Street, reading the same 3 items over and over without absorbing any of them. His name was Callum. He was 41 years old. He owned a plumbing company in Ottawa with 6 employees and a van that needed new brakes. And he had spent the last 4 years becoming very good at not needing anything from anyone he couldn't already provide for himself. The arrangement had come from his sister Bev. The way most things Callum hadn't planned came from Bev. Casually, across a Sunday dinner table, between passing the potatoes and arguing about whether the Senators had any shot at the playoffs. "There's someone I'd like you to meet," she'd said. "Just coffee. Or dinner. Whatever you're comfortable with." Callum had said he'd think about it, which Bev understood to mean no, and which he understood to mean no as well. But Bev was patient the way rivers are patient, and 4 weeks later he had somehow agreed to a Wednesday at 7. He knew her name, Marin. He knew she worked in urban planning for the city. He knew she had grown up in Fredericton and moved to Ottawa 11 years ago. He knew this because Bev had texted him 3 paragraphs of background information that he had read twice in the parking lot of a Canadian Tire, and then put his phone face down on the passenger seat. What he didn't know was what to do with any of it. His son Theo, not the Theo in the list, a different one, his Theo, age 11, had found out the way 11-year-olds found out things, which was by existing in the same house and having ears. Callum had been on the phone with Bev confirming the reservation when Theo walked into the kitchen for a glass of water and then stood there for approximately 30 seconds longer than it took to pour one. After Callum hung up, Theo was sitting at the kitchen island with the look of someone who had already processed the information and arrived at a conclusion. "Is it a date?" Theo said. It wasn't a question. "It's dinner," Callum said. Theo considered this the way he considered most things, which was thoroughly and without much expression. Then he said, "Okay," and took his water and went back upstairs. Callum had expected more. He wasn't sure if the lack of more was better or worse. The night before, Theo had appeared in the doorway of Callum's room, while Callum was looking at his closet with the particular blankness of a man who had never had to think about this before, and suddenly needed to. He owned dress shirts. He owned flannels. He owned exactly one blazer that he'd bought for his cousin's wedding 3 years ago and hadn't worn since. "The gray one," Theo said from the doorway without having been asked. "The gray what?" "The shirt. The gray one with the buttons." "Why that one?" Theo shrugged with one shoulder. "It looks like you, but less like you just came from work." Callum put on the gray shirt. Theo did not follow him to the door when he left. He was at the kitchen table doing homework, head down, pencil moving. But when Callum said he was heading out, Theo looked up briefly, and something moved across his face that was not quite concern and not quite hope, and was something in between that Callum filed away to think about later. "Don't be weird about it," Theo said. "I'm not going to be weird about it. You're already being a little weird about it." Callum had no response to this because it was accurate. He grabbed his jacket. "She's a person," Theo added, looking back down at his homework. "Just talk to her like a person." He said it the way he said things that were obvious to him, which was plainly and without decoration. Callum stood in the doorway for a moment longer than necessary, then left. He drove to the glebe. He parked 4 blocks from the restaurant and walked, which gave him time he did not use well. It was early March in Ottawa, the kind of cold that had overstayed its welcome, the kind the city carried in its bones by this point in the year. There was still salt on the sidewalks from last week. His breath showed ahead of him in small clouds that vanished before they could become anything. He arrived at Birchwood 7 minutes early. He stood outside and read the menu in the window 3 times. Then he checked his watch. Then he looked up the street in both directions for no reason he could name. He was still standing there at 6:58 when he heard footsteps on the pavement, brisk and purposeful, the sound of someone who had been moving faster than a walk and was now making an effort to appear, as though they hadn't been. He turned. She was coming from the direction of the parking garage on Bank Street, coat buttoned up, scarf slightly crooked. a canvas tote bag over one shoulder that had a small pine tree embroidered on it. Her hair was dark and pulled back in a way that was not fully committed to itself, a few pieces loose around her face, catching in the cold. She was scanning the front of the restaurant when she found him standing there, and something in her expression shifted. A small recalibration. She slowed. He opened the door. She stepped into the warmth of the restaurant, and Callum was already reaching for something to say. His name, probably, or something equally unremarkable. When she turned toward him, tucked her chin slightly, and said in a voice just low enough for the space between them, "I almost turned around twice on the way here. Just so you know." Callum looked at her. "I thought you should know," she said. "So we start even." He didn't say anything for a moment. His hand was still on the door. He was aware of this because it had gone slightly cold. "I sat in my car for 11 minutes before I got here," he said. Something in her face softened. Not into pity, into recognition. "Okay," she said. "Then we're even." They were seated near the window, a table for two, that looked out onto Elgin Street, and the ordinary Wednesday night movement of the city beyond it. The restaurant was the kind that had dark wood and low lighting, and didn't try too hard about it, which Callum appreciated. They ordered drinks. Water first, then something warmer. "Bev didn't tell me much," Marin said, after they'd looked at the menus long enough to make a reasonable pretense of reading them. "She didn't tell me much either," Callum said. "She told me you work in urban planning. She told me you have a son. She told me you grew up in Fredericton. She told me you've been doing this alone for a while." The word "alone" arrived on the table between them. Neither of them moved it. "4 years," Callum said. Marin nodded once. The kind of nod that didn't perform anything. She'd heard it. "How old is your son?" 11. "His name is Theo." "What's he like?" Callum thought about this honestly, which meant he took a moment. "He's the most pragmatic person I've ever met," he said. "He researches things before he commits to an opinion. He makes very good sandwiches. He has exactly 2 friends and considers that sufficient. Sounds like good company." "He told me not to be weird tonight." Marin smiled. It was quick and genuine and disappeared almost before it finished, the way smiles did when they weren't being performed. "Is that his main concern? Weirdness?" "He has concerns about a lot of things," Callum said. "He just expresses them in the form of instructions." She laughed, short and real, a slightly surprised sound, as though she hadn't been expecting to yet. Callum found that something in his chest loosened a fraction at the sound of it. They ordered. The conversation found its footing the way conversations sometimes did, between people who were both making a genuine effort and were both trying not to show how much effort they were making. He learned that she had spent 8 years on the light rail expansion plan, before it had been shelved in a budget review, and that she spoke about this with the measured tone of someone who had grieved it properly and arrived somewhere on the other side. She learned that he had started his plumbing company at 32, with 1 truck and no employees, and that he still did service calls himself sometimes because he didn't know how to stop. She ordered the halibut. He ordered the lamb. Neither of them talked about the weather. It was somewhere between the main course and the moment when the server came by to offer the dessert menu that Callum noticed a thing he hadn't noticed at first. She had a ring on her right hand. Not her left, her right. A plain silver band on her index finger, the kind that had been worn long enough to leave a faint mark when it wasn't there. She'd been turning it slightly throughout the evening, a small unconscious motion, the kind of habit that meant the person wasn't always aware they were doing it. He didn't ask about it then. He asked about it later, when they were on their second drinks, and the restaurant had quieted around them in the way that restaurants did when the main rush had passed. "The ring," he said. "Right hand." She glanced down at it, then back up at him, and he understood she wasn't offended by the question, just deciding how much of the answer to give. "It was my mother's," she said. "She passed away 3 years ago. I don't wear jewelry usually, but this," she looked at it briefly. "I started wearing it about 6 months after. I don't know exactly why. I just wanted it somewhere on me." Callum held that for a moment. He turned his water glass once on the tablecloth. "Can I show you something?" he said. "Okay." He reached into the inner pocket of his blazer and took out his wallet, and from the back of it, behind his license and behind a coffee loyalty card he'd been meaning to throw away for 2 years, he removed a photograph. Small, worn at the corners, the kind that had been handled often enough to lose some of its surface sheen. He set it on the table and turned it to face her. It was a photograph of a woman and a small boy, maybe 4 years old at the time it was taken. Both of them in rubber boots, at the edge of what was clearly a lake somewhere in September, the light that particular low gold of early fall. The woman was looking at the camera. The boy was looking at something in the water. "My wife," Callum said. "And Theo." Marin looked at the photograph for a long moment. She didn't do the thing people sometimes did, which was rush past it. She let it be what it was. "She looks like someone who had very specific opinions," Marin said. Callum looked at the photograph. "She did," he said, "about nearly everything. It was one of the best things about her." He picked up the photo and put it back in his wallet carefully in its same spot. "Why did you bring that?" she asked. Not accusatory, just genuinely curious. Callum thought about this. "I carry it everywhere," he said. "I've had it in my wallet since she died. I didn't bring it for any specific reason tonight." He paused. "Or maybe I did and I didn't know it until now." Marin was quiet for a moment. She was turning the ring again slowly, but she seemed to realize she was doing it and stopped. "My mother would have had a lot to say about this," she said. "About tonight. About the whole situation." Her eyes went to the window, the street beyond it, and back. "She'd probably have told me I was overthinking it. She said that a lot. She was usually right." "What would she say about tonight specifically?" Marin considered. "She'd probably say the halibut was a safe choice. And that I should have loosened up 20 minutes earlier than I did." Callum looked at her. "You seemed loose to me." "I had a very detailed internal monologue going about whether to say the thing I said at the door." She looked at him steadily. "I almost didn't say it. I'm glad you did. I thought it might be too much, as an opener." "It was the right opener," Callum said, and he meant it in a way that didn't require elaborating on, and she seemed to understand that. The server brought the dessert menus, and they both declined without consulting each other. Callum noticed this. He also noticed that she'd been sitting with her coat over the back of her chair all evening, not rushing, not checking her phone, not performing the mild impatience of someone who was managing their time. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You've been asking me things all evening." "This is different." She waited. "Earlier, at the door. You said you almost turned around twice." He held her gaze. "Most people don't lead with that. Most people would have kept it." Marin was quiet for a moment. She looked down at the table, not away. The kind of look that meant she was deciding how honest to be, not whether to be honest at all. "My mother used to say that the things you don't say take up more space than the things you do," she said finally. She meant it about everything. She meant it about arguments and feelings and— She paused. "About walking into situations that scare you and acting like they don't." She looked at the ring. "I've spent 3 years trying to actually do what she said instead of just understanding it." Callum didn't say anything. He was thinking about Theo at the kitchen island with his glass of water, and the look on his face when he'd said okay, and the thing that had passed across his features the night before in the doorway. "My son doesn't talk much about his mother," he said. "Not directly. He was 7 when she died. He doesn't bring her up the way you'd expect a kid to. But sometimes he does something, a gesture or a phrase, or the way he approaches a problem, and I can see her in it so clearly He stopped. "It stopped me for a long time, seeing her in him. I couldn't always tell if it was a comfort or the other thing." "What is it now?" Marin asked. Callum thought about it. "It's still both," he said, "but the ratio's changed." She nodded. That single, unhurried "I-not." They paid the bill without a negotiation about it. He covered it. She said thank you in the way that meant she'd get the next one, if there was a next one, and both of them let that sentence exist without examining it too hard. They walked out at 9:26. The cold was sharp and unceremonious, and their breath showed again in small clouds in front of them. The street had thinned out. The city was doing its quieter version of itself. They stood on the sidewalk outside Birchwood, the way people stood when something was ending that neither person was entirely sure how to close. Callum knew the shape of this moment. He had imagined it, vaguely and without wanting to, at some point in the past week. The polite finish. The thanks for a nice evening. The clean exit that would make it easy to return to the life he'd built, the one that was orderly and capable, and asked nothing of him that he wasn't already prepared to give. This was nice, Maren said. It was, Callum agreed. She shifted the tote bag on her shoulder. She looked up the street in the direction of the parking garage. Then she looked back at him. I'm going to do the thing my mother told me not to do, she said. And not say something I should probably say. Say it. I'm thinking about it. Say it anyway. She looked at him. I thought tonight was going to be uncomfortable. I was prepared for uncomfortable. I had a whole plan for polite and uncomfortable. A brief pause. It wasn't that. Callum held that. I thought it was going to be that too, he said. She almost smiled. Almost. She turned toward the street. Good night, Callum. Good night. She started walking. He watched her go. He turned in the direction of where he'd left his car, 4 blocks north, and started walking. His hands were in his jacket pockets. His footsteps were even on the pavement, unhurried, the ordinary motion of a man going where he was going. 6 steps. 9. 12. He stopped. He stood on the sidewalk in the cold with the city moving around him, and he was aware with a clarity he hadn't expected of the specific weight of what he was doing. He had done this before. Not with Maren. He had never met Maren before tonight, but he had done this version of the moment before, in different forms, over 4 years. The moment where something appeared that had the quality of being real in a way that could also cost something. And he had always found the reasonable thing to do, which was to let it recede, and go home to the life he managed well, and not ask anything more of himself than that life already asked. He was very good at the reasonable thing. Behind him, her footsteps were fading. He thought about Theo saying she's a person. He thought about the photograph in his wallet, the rubber boots, the low gold September light. He thought about Maren turning her mother's ring, stopping herself. He thought about the way she'd said it wasn't that, looking at him the way she'd looked at him in the restaurant, not performing anything, just present and honest, and a little bit scared in exactly the same way he was. He turned around. She was half a block away, walking with her head slightly forward into the cold. Maren. She stopped. She turned. Across the distance between them, her face was clear in the streetlight, and she didn't look surprised, which told him something. Callum walked back toward her. He didn't have anything prepared. When he reached her, he was aware that he didn't have a speech, didn't have anything that matched what he actually meant, and so he said the only true thing he could find quickly enough to say. I'd like to do this again. This specifically. Standing outside in the cold. Dinner, he said. Or whatever, she repeated. The way you repeated something to understand the size of it. I'll call you, he said. This week. All right, she said. She held his gaze for a moment. I'll answer. She turned and walked to her car. Callum turned and walked to his. He drove back through the glebe and up onto the 417 heading east, and the city moved past the windows in its nighttime mode, lit and quiet and indifferent to the fact that something had happened in it, tonight that he was not yet sure how to name. He got home at 10:10. The main floor was dark except for the kitchen light, which Theo always left on when he went to bed. Callum had never asked him to do this, and Theo had never mentioned it. It was simply a thing he did quietly and had been doing for 3 years. Callum hung up his jacket. He went to the kitchen and drank a glass of water. He stood at the counter for a moment with no particular purpose, just standing there in the kitchen light, and then he turned off the tap and went upstairs. Theo's door was open 2 inches, the way he always left it. Callum sat down on the floor in the hallway, back against the wall. It wasn't a thing he planned. He just ended up there. He took out his wallet and took out the photograph. Set it on his knee. He looked at it for a long time, the 2 of them in their rubber boots, the September lake, behind them. The particular way his wife had looked at the camera, like she was daring it to show her as anything less than herself. He thought about a lot of things. He thought about the ring on the right hand, About the phrase, "the things you don't say take up more space." About Marin's face in the restaurant when he'd put the photograph on the table, the way she'd looked at it like it deserved to be looked at properly. He thought about Theo's okay at the kitchen island, about the 2 friends that Theo considered sufficient, about the way his son moved through the world, measured, careful, deeply loyal to whatever he'd decided was true, so much like his mother in that specific way that it had taken Callum 2 full years to be able to see it without having to look away. He put the photograph back in his wallet. From behind the door, 2 inches open, he heard Theo's breathing. Slow and even, the sound of someone fully asleep and completely elsewhere. He did not have the kind of easy relationship with hope that some people seem to carry around effortlessly. He had learned, over the past 4 years, to be careful with it, to not mistake a good evening for a trajectory, to hold things at a reasonable distance until there was a reason not to. But he was 41 years old, and he had just had dinner with a woman who'd led with her fear instead of hiding it. And there was a photograph in his wallet of a lake in September, and his son was asleep 2 inches away, and the kitchen light was on. He didn't know what any of it meant yet. He didn't need to know tonight. He got up. He went to bed. In the morning, Theo was already at the table when Callum came downstairs, eating cereal, reading something on his phone. He didn't look up immediately. Then, "How was it?" Callum poured coffee. "Good." Theo looked up now. He had his mother's way of assessing a situation without showing he was doing it, the particular quality of attention that looked like stillness. He studied Callum's face for approximately 3 seconds. "Good like fine," he said. Or, "Good like actually." "Good like actually," Callum said. Theo looked at him for 1 more second. Then he went back to his phone. "Okay," he said. That was all. But he was smiling very slightly at the screen, not performing it, not for Callum's benefit, just the small private smile of someone whose theory had turned out to be correct. They met again 2 weeks later, on a Saturday afternoon, in a small park near the canal in the glebe, where the ice was finally softening at the edges and the light had that first pale suggestion of a different season coming. Callum had brought coffee in a thermos. Marin had brought a paper bag with pastries from a Lebanese bakery on Dalhousie that she said she went to every time she needed to feel like a person again. Callum had told Theo. Not the details, but the fact of it. Theo had said, "The urban planning one?" Callum had said yes. Theo had thought about this for a moment and then said, "Is she interesting?" "She is," Callum said. Theo nodded. He seemed to consider whether to say the next thing, and then he said it. Interesting is better than nice. He meant it as a general observation about the world. Callum knew this because Theo mostly made general observations about the world. At the park, Marin arrived with the pastries and her scarf slightly crooked again, and when she saw the thermos, she said, "Thank God," because she'd forgotten that she was a person who needed warm things in March and had only remembered on the walk over. They sat on a bench near the canal. The city was doing its tentative early March thing, still cold but with less conviction. Callum poured coffee. Marin opened the bag and held it toward him. "My mother would have approved of this bench," she said. She was a bench person. She had opinions about public seating. What's a bench person? Someone who thinks the quality of a public bench says something true about a city's intentions. She looked at the bench they were sitting on. "This one's decent. Not too slatted. I've never evaluated a bench before. You will now. That's what happens. I've ruined benches for you." Callum looked at the bench. He looked at the canal. He was aware that he was sitting here easily, in the ordinary way of a person sitting on a bench in March, and that this was not something he had been capable of in quite this way for a while. They had been there almost an hour when he heard footsteps on the path behind them, the particular cadence of someone moving with direction. He didn't turn immediately, and then Theo came around the bench from the left side, hands in his pockets, in his winter jacket with the hood, not up even though it was still cold, because Theo had decided at some point that the hood was unnecessary and no weather condition had yet changed his mind. He stopped. He looked at Marin. Marin looked at him. Callum said, "Theo, this is Marin." Theo assessed her with the same 3-second thoroughness he'd applied to Callum at breakfast 2 weeks ago. Marin did not crouch down or use a special tone. She just met his eyes and waited. "Hi," Theo said. "Hi," Marin said. Theo looked at the bag. "Are those from the Lebanese place on Dalhousie?" Marin looked at the bag, then at him. "You know it? The ones with the cheese." She reached into the bag and held one out. Theo took it. He sat down on the end of the bench, not between them, at the far end with a reasonable buffer, and ate his pastry while looking at the canal. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Theo said, still looking at the canal, "The ice is going to be fully gone by next week." "Probably sooner," Marin said. "We're getting a warm front Thursday." Theo considered this. "How do you know that?" "Part of my job is watching how cities change in different weather." "You pay attention to the forecasts." Theo looked at her for the first time since he'd sat down. It was a direct look, the kind that didn't apologize for itself. What does urban planning actually mean? It means deciding how a city grows. Where things get built, how people move through spaces, what gets kept, and what doesn't. Who decides? Ideally, a lot of people. In practice, it's complicated. Theo turned this over. "That sounds frustrating." "Often," Marin said. "But sometimes you get it right, and it actually helps someone's life in a way they don't notice, which is the best kind of helping." Theo was quiet for a moment, looking back at the canal. Callum had not said anything. He had been sitting here watching his son think about this, watching the thing that Theo did when something had earned his consideration. "The thing about the bench," Theo said finally, not to either of them in particular. "The one near the station on Rideau. The one that faces the wrong way." "Which one?" Marin said. "It faces the parking lot instead of the street. If you're waiting for someone, it'd be easier if it faced the street. You could see them coming." Marin looked at him. Something moved in her expression. "You're right," she said. "I know exactly which one you mean. It faces the wrong direction." Theo looked at her. "Can you fix it?" "Not that specific bench," she said. "But I can make sure the next one gets placed right." Theo held her gaze for a moment longer than he usually held anyone's. Then he looked back at the canal. "Okay," he said. He finished his pastry. He stayed on the end of the bench. After a while, without saying anything, he moved 3 inches closer to the middle. Callum was looking at the canal. He was looking at the canal because there were things happening in his face that he preferred to manage privately. The ice at the edges of the water was soft and pale, and giving way to something else the way things did at the end of March in Ottawa, slowly, then all at once. Marin said nothing. She was looking at the canal too. After a while she said quietly, not quite to him, "Your son notices things." Callum said, "He always has." There was a long pause. A dog went past on the path. Somewhere further down the canal, 2 kids were arguing about something and then not arguing. Theo said, "Are you going to come back?" He said it to the canal, but it was not to the canal. Marin didn't answer right away. She took it seriously, the way the question deserved to be taken. Then she said, "That's the plan." Theo nodded once, satisfied the way he was satisfied when something confirmed what he'd already suspected. He didn't say anything else about it. He stayed on the bench until the thermos and the bag was finished, and the light had shifted into that flatter late afternoon mode that meant the day was wrapping itself up. Then he stood, said he was going to check if the path down by the locks was clear, and walked away with his hands in his pockets and his hood still sensibly down. Callum watched him go. "He asked if you were coming back," he said. "He did," Marin said. "He doesn't ask things he doesn't care about the answer to." "I know," she said. "I could tell." Callum looked at the canal, at the ice that was already different than it had been an hour ago. Edges pulling back, the water underneath it going about its business, patient and unhurried, the way water always was about the spring. He thought about 11 minutes in a parking lot, about a photograph in a wallet, about Theo, 3 inches closer to the middle of the bench, eating a pastry from the Lebanese place, asking a woman he'd just met whether she could fix the direction of a bench. He didn't know what the next weeks would look like. He didn't know how any of this went from here, in the specific and practical sense. He just knew that he was sitting on a bench in March in Ottawa, and the ice was going, and Marin was beside him, and his son was somewhere down the path checking on the locks, and that the life he had built, the good, careful, sufficient life, had just made a small amount of room for something it hadn't previously included. He hadn't asked it to. It had just happened, the way things did when you stopped standing in the way of them. He poured the last of what was left in the thermos into her cup without asking. She said thank you. He said you're welcome. Down the path, Theo reappeared from around the bend, hands still in his pockets, moving at his usual unhurried pace, and he lifted one hand briefly as he approached in a gesture that meant the locks were fine, the path was fine, everything was fine. Callum raised a hand back. The ice kept going,